Michéle and Joanne are two apparently sensible women resident on the Cape Peninsula who have devoted substantial fractions of their lives to crime. And why anyone in their situation, rooted in their communities, surrounded by loving friends and family, would decide to do such an outlandish thing is what we are hoping they will, amongst other things, talk about today. Why is crime so fascinating? Why are people, like everyone here today, attracted to the idea of exploring what lies beyond the pale? But we're also hoping that through the agency of the questions that you've asked, and in what I assume will be their introduction, they'll also give us some clues, and the pun is intended, to enable us to unravel the mysteries of writing crime stories. Now, you've probably read the mini introductions that we provided in our announcements about today's event. The point being that both Michéle and Joanne have written a number and are busy with writing crime mysteries, crime novels, crime detective stories. Their writing in both cases extends far beyond the boundaries of crime. Michéle has been engaged for all the years and decades that I've known her in writing for the screen. Joanne has written extensively in other fields. Most recently, she's published a memoir, Death and the After Parties, that has been extremely positively received. So let's leave it at that and invite Michéle and Joanne to raise the questions that you've raised and respond to them.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you very much. Hi, I'm Michéle Rowe. I'm the aforementioned screenwriter and crime writer that Richard mentioned. And I'm very happy and pleased to be meeting with you today. It's always great to have crime aficionados and crime enthusiasts. I know that we're quite a big group of people in the world. Actually, so many people are so obsessed with criminal activities. It makes you wonder what really goes on in most people's heads. But it's very nice to have you here and welcome. And I hope that we can answer some of your questions.
Thanks, Michéle. I'm Joanne Hichens. As Richard said, I'm a Cape Town author. I've written 3 crime novels, co-written one of them, and then followed on with 2 others, the Ray Valentine series. I write a series about a private investigator called Ray Valentine. And I have a whole lot of fun with my crime writing. Then what happened in my life was that my husband very sadly passed away. And instead of focusing on crime writing, I went on to write a memoir on death and dying. So I've kind of taken a little bit of a hiatus from crime writing, but I really want to get back to it because I have some great ideas. And what I always find with crime writing, it takes me away from myself. I really can have fun with it. I'm putting myself in this very strange situation where my investigator has to find the truth. And it's so different from my often quite mundane life. And that's why I love writing crime. So hopefully there'll be a new one in the next year or so. Shall we start, Mish, with our questions?
Yes, we can. And maybe, Joanne, this one you could answer. It's from Anne. And she asks, please, can you explain the difference between crime, mysteries, thrillers, and police procedurals? Because she's very confused. So maybe you can just elaborate on that.
Okay, I think it's about as confusing as gender identity these days, because there are so many different genres of the crime novel. And in fact, I was trying to list them the other day, and I think I'd come up with at least 32 different ways of writing crime, or different genres or subgenres. So I've made a little bit of a list. The mystery is much more gentle, and we used to call it a cozy in the days of Agatha Christie, for example, when the crimes were largely solved in locked rooms by people like Miss Marple and Hercule Poirot. They were very civilized, very sophisticated. The violence was very understated, and it was a kind of an easy read. And by the end of the book, through the puzzle, through observation and figuring out a puzzle, in a sense, the mystery would be solved. And of course, the mystery would be, who is the killer? Then what happened was we went on, almost as a backlash to the cozies that were happening in Britain, to begin writing what were called the hard-boiled crime novels, which really were about the streets of America. The hard-boiled crime novels brought the underbelly to the reader, what was really going on in the big cities. They wanted to depart from this cozy mystery fiction and really show the truth of violence, the truth of gangs and gangsters, and the truth of violent, explicit murder. So if one looks at it in that sense, you've got the cozy mystery and the hard-boiled crime, and that's where it all started from. And then from that, it's split into all sorts of other genres of crime. For example, the general suspense thriller. You know, a lot of us call them airport books. You go and you buy a thriller that you know is going to keep you satisfied on your trip for the next 13 or 14 hours. It's action-packed, the stakes are high. It often has a tight story, has great plotting, perhaps less character development, as the focus is generally on the action. But, you know, and I'm thinking of examples like The Bourne Identity, for example, which has got lots of skop, skiet and donner. And for those of you that don't live in South Africa, that means kicking, hitting, shooting guns. So we've taken the mean streets one step further, and we've introduced all these weapons and lots of action. And then again, within that whole framework of the thriller, you'll get the legal thriller, which is often set in courtrooms. You have an accused, and it is now up to the writer to show whether the accused is guilty or not. And if one's going to write a legal thriller, then clearly you need to have a very good understanding of how the law works, or it's something that you've got to research properly. Then we go on to the military thriller, which in the same sense is set on a military base or in some war-torn country. And those are actually books that I'm quite interested in at the moment. And then I always feel so much better about South Africa, because I feel at least we have some law and order here. The medical thriller, the forensic thriller, a lot of us might watch CSI on TV, or we read Bones. Temperance Brennan is the forensic doctor who gets a body and now has to figure out what happened to that body. How did the woman die? How was she murdered? And what clues can she find in order to take her towards the actual vicious killer? Police procedurals. This is a big one. A lot of people write thrillers called police procedurals. And in the same way, it's based on a number of police who are contracted to find a killer or to find out who's responsible for a crime. Yeah. Yeah, again, one has to be meticulous with the research. If you're going to write a police procedural, because you will be writing from the point of view of a policeman, probably, whether it's in first person or third person, you have to understand what the police do in order to research and investigate their crimes. Then, of course, there's the hottie, private investigator crime. And I think a lot of writers turn to this because there is probably less research involved. A private investigator is a bit of a lone figure. A private investigator acts on their own. They don't even need to have special qualifications. Whereas with police, one would hope that they've been through the police academy, that they understand the rules and regulations of the trade. but the private investigator can do things that perhaps the police can't do, because the police, of course, have got to stay on the right side of the law. So I think that will give you a sense of the many different kinds of crime books that exist in the many different genres. And once one has a sense of that, then as a writer, I think it's easier then to decide, okay, well, this is what I'm doing. I want to write a mystery, or no, I want to write a thriller or a spy thriller. So I hope that helps. It is confusing, but most writers do choose a specific genre. Certainly, whether it's police or PI, they choose a certain type of protagonist that is going to suit them as a storyteller and suit them in figuring out the crime and finding justice. Would you like to add to that, Mish?
Yes, I think that there's, I mean, as many different ways as you can write anything that revolves around a crime. There are combinations. You get historical crime fiction, for example, things that are set in the Tudor era or Victorian era. You can get science fiction crossover with crime. You love stories that cross over with crime. I mean, crime is a sort of such a wide, that's one of the great things about crime. It's such a wide ranging thing. So it tends to get boxed into these you know, specific kind of tropes, but actually it's not like that at all. And often it can range very, very far. It can touch on many different subjects. It can touch on history, it can touch on politics, on socio-cultural issues. And really, as long as there's a crime in it, you know, you could look at Donna Tartt's Secret History. That is a crime story, for example. Emma is a crime story, for example, or a mystery. Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. It's such a wide kind of range of work that can come under that heading. But what is convenient about it is if it's classified as crime, because crime is such a popular genre, everyone wants to read crime, you've got a better chance of getting it published. And that was sort of, in a way, when I started writing, I thought I want to write about this. I want to write about politics. I want to write about culture. I want to write about race. I want to write about things that are quite difficult to write about, but they're not difficult if you're writing crime, because it's about a crime, it doesn't sort of matter what else goes on around it. As long as you focus on, okay, this is the aim of a crime story, is to set up a question and to answer the question and to build suspense along the way. You can basically do anything you like if you do that one basic thing. And I think that is the great thing about crime and why people are so fascinated by it. And of course, you can have any range of characters. You can have any sort of person. You know, it can be a fashion designer. I mean, if you look at the Versace story, for example, and more and more people are becoming really interested in true crime stories. So of course, that's another massive area of interest that people are becoming more and more interested in. And of course, there's a crossover with cybercrime, because now forensics have become so incredibly complex and so brilliant, and DNA testing. And I mean, there's just so many amazing things going on in the detection or technical part of criminal investigation, that if you're a particularly technical person or you're interested in cybercrime and so on, you know, that is a whole new area that's just starting to open up. So I agree with Joan, there's so many categories, and it's literally you can literally write anything you like. As long as there's a crime involved, you can write anything.
But then I would ask a question. The crime fiction does definitely have a certain identity. Yeah, so when you say one can write anything, I agree completely. And I think that there are so many genres and subgenres in the field, and things are developing. What would make a book a crime fiction novel? kind of that it would end up on the stands at a bookshop as a crime novel? I mean,
Well,
I'm asking you, Mish, just for my own interest. I mean, do you think there's something that sets a crime fiction novel apart?
yes, I think it depends on how a publisher chooses to sell a story and how, I mean, if you look at a writer, for example, the Scottish writer Denise Mina, who wrote a book not that long ago, which I think was about Peter Manuel, who was, you know, the Ripper, the Yorkshire Ripper. And she wrote a book, it's a novel. It's a brilliant novel. I think it was also up for a Booker last year. And she is a crime writer, it is a crime book, but more and more and more those things are starting to blur. And I think we can also thank Netflix for that and television for that, because as a screenwriter, what I see is that there's so many fusions of genres in television. Television's a fast-moving thing. I mean, a book takes 18 months to get from your desk, if you're lucky, onto a shelf, you know, in a bookshop. But film and television move so quickly. You could have hundreds of shows being developed, crime shows being developed at the same time, and a hungry audience that's seeking novelty. And more you're getting this kind of crossover of genres, especially because of sci-fi, which is becoming huge. So I think, yes, in a way, the publishers are kind of behind what the writers are doing. I think the writers are definitely moving out. Look, there's always going to be the Michael Connollys, the Lee Childs, these people who churn out every, 9 months, they've got a novel out that's the same character. There are not many variations on the theme, and you know what you're going to get, and you're buying the book because you know what you're going to get and you enjoy it. But more and more, I think there is a warping and changing of those boundaries. And I think that's what makes crime writing very exciting. It's always been a very fast evolving medium.
Well, so I'm not sure we've clarified exactly what crime writing is. Maybe it's also because our world has just become so much more complicated, and there are also so many different kind of crimes, from white collar to blue collar to, whatever. So every story somehow does revolve around deception or betrayal or hurt. And maybe that's all, called crime in the end.
Yeah.
Mish, shall we get on to the questions? And I'm sure we'll be coming back to some of these things as well that we talk about.
Okay, I have a question here about Bonnie SP,
yes.
which I'd like to answer. And she says, sense of place in a crime novel is important. And I've been advised to treat where the novel is set as an additional character, right? So in other words, treat place as a character. And my question is, can you be too local? So Bonnie's obviously writing from South Africa, and she's talking about her concerns about South African language, slang, the names of characters and place settings, and would these be confusing for an international market? So again, I've got to come back to this concern about being too local. I think it really does depend on what kind of book you are writing. To pick up on what Joanne said earlier, I mean, some books can be set, these kind of thriller airport novels are often quite generic in where they're set. Like it'll be set in New York, or it'll be set in Los Angeles, or it'll be set in Paris. If you think of the Bourne Identity, it doesn't go into place. It really is kind of about moving people through landscapes very quickly. And the characters are not really specifically centered in an area. They're kind of international in a way. The spies, the high-powered kind of PIs or whatever, they move through a lot of different environments, and they're not necessarily specific. But if you are, if you think of books, I mean, I have to think, for example, of somebody like Elmo Leonard, who uses character and he uses dialogue mostly. And with him, the place is less important. But it's important as a signifier of the actual character. So in other words, you would say, okay, well, he's like a guy from Detroit, just the way he speaks, the way he articulates his philosophy. He's from Florida. I mean, those are two places that Elmo Leonard uses a lot. You don't get a lot of information about exactly what the city looks like or what the streets look like or the rooms look like, but through the way that the characters speak and the things that they say and the things that preoccupy them, you get a sense of place. So I think America generally, American writers don't need to be too specific because we are so familiar with American culture that they use a kind of shorthand that we as readers immediately pick up on. But I think place is a major element in a story for me, as personally. And I think it's essential to the narrative, and it plays like a major role in creating mood and subtext. I mean, if you think of Venice in Donna Leon's novels or Ian Rankin's Edinburgh, for example, and I think geography also suggests settings that can be used to enhance a character's emotional response. So if a female character lives in a dangerous city and enters a zone of jeopardy like an empty car park at night, she might feel vulnerable and even terrified. And if she happens to be the killer, she might view that same area for how it supports or hinders her kind of plan. So we know that serial killers, for example, they often hunt and kill in the same sort of location, usually in these out-of-way places like forests or woods or alleyways or basements. So place is really, really important. And I think personally, maybe because I come from a film background and I often had to search for locations in my job, then geography is very important. In fact, a place usually, when I write, the place actually comes before my characters or my story or my themes. Look at my first book, What Hidden Lies. It's set in the Noordhoek Valley in Cape Town, and I specifically wanted to write or make use of this deserted house, which was set amongst these kind of 9 palm trees on the side of the mountain looking out over the sea. And I'd actually found this house years ago. It no longer exists, it's been demolished. And this place just haunted me. I just thought of it as it would be a brilliant place for some sort of murder or crime or something to happen. And it sort of stayed in my consciousness. And it's the same with my second book, which is set in an area where a lot of removals took place. A lot of colored people were removed. There were strawberry and flower farmers, and they were moved out of that area under apartheid, and it became taken over by white people, sort of white suburbs. And this idea of that there was this trace memory in this land, that things had happened before, crimes had been committed. These were political crimes, but I mean, there's also murder, obviously, in the book. But that fascinated me. So I think it will be different for every writer. Some people have a very strong sense of place. They're very obsessed with geography. Other people, not so much. They may be much more focused on dialogue or much more focused on action. So I don't know, how do you feel about that, Joe, about place? Joe, I think you muted.
Oh, you're mute.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Okay, there we go. I agree with you. And it's interesting to hear your very personal take on it. I think a place can definitely be seen as another character in a book, in a sense that they do take on meaning. You know, and I'm thinking, for example, of the Scandinavian settings and everything that comes with a crime story being set in that incredibly bleak, snowbound area where perhaps there are not many people, or even in South Africa, where we are known for our huge gaps between the rich and the poor. poverty is rampant. So I think wherever you do set your crime novel, you're going to be sitting with a whole history of that place, the social history, the economic history, any history of war, any history of conflict. And one can't help but bring that into the book. And that's when a character, or that's when a place almost takes on the sense of being another character. That when we start reading about the place, we get to know the place almost as if we would get to know a person. And obviously we're not personifying that place, but we are creating a setting that people can relate to and that they can understand. And they can understand that, yes, this crime could happen in this place. This crime could happen in this completely abandoned, snowbound Antarctic mission because of the geography of it, but also because of the loneliness that comes with it, the inability to see your loved ones or whatever. So place, I think, is very important, and it's something that each of us, I think, when we write crime novels, need to look at, because also our characters are going to do things particular to that place and particular to that time. So it all works hand in hand. So yeah, that's my 2 cents worth. I would say we need to focus on place. And as you said, people like Elmore Leonard, they give place less of the foreground, but their characters are so particularly rooted in that place and use the kind of language that is used in that place and the expressions used in that place. And the stories are so enmeshed in the culture of the place that, you know, he doesn't need to have pages and pages of description. And that's not what I'm saying. I don't think one has to describe a place to death, but certainly have a sense of the place and a sense of a history of the place and a sense of how that story that you're writing is going to influence the investigation into the crime that happened in that place.
So. Yeah, they're very interesting. I heard an interview with Peter Hoeg, who wrote Miss Miller's Feeling for Snow, which is a brilliant crime novel. And he didn't set out to write a crime novel, but it was marketed as a crime novel and it sold remarkably well. But he was speaking that Snow was his character. And because they're in Denmark and Norway, and well, particularly amongst the Greenlanders, there's so many words for snow, for all the different types of textures of snow and so on. The snow itself became a character, like a very specific character in the book. And I mean, in light of what Bonnie asked, really, which is about South Africanisms, I mean, I use a lot of South Africanisms in my books, and so does Jo. And I'm sure she can, you know, will have the same opinion that, in fact, when publishers look at it, and even when my books have gone into translation, they tend to try and keep the flavor of that language and those words and those places, because that's what makes your book different to a book that's set in Atlanta or set in Paris or whatever, you know. And publishers themselves actually like books to be quite specific. Readers like to open a book and go to a foreign country. You know, I read Donna Leon because I want to go and spend the afternoon in Venice when I'm reading my book. So I think the more you sense, the stronger your sense of place and the particularity of place, the better, actually. And really, don't be afraid of South Africanisms, because we are the crime capital of the world. And unfortunately, and I think we should, you know, at least make that should have some advantages for us. So
I think also for those of us living in Cape Town or Johannesburg, each of these places offer the most wonderful backdrop to crimes and the most specific crimes that happen, you know, in these areas, from hijacking to you know, gangsters in the Cape Flats. And the same goes for crimes that happen in areas in you know, the world over, in different locations. But I think if one's living in this country or in any country, you've got to capitalize on what you have. Unless you want to move somewhere and really figure out how the people work and what the culture is, and unless you can really authenticate that and take it on, your best bet in writing crime and any other crime, I feel, is to set it in places that you know, so that you know not only the setting, but you know the history and the feeling and just what it means to so many people. So yeah, at this stage, I don't know how far you are, Bonnie, with your writing, but yeah, and I also think people often ask, will this be suitable for an international market? Yeah, unfortunately, there are no guarantees in this game at all. So the best is to write the book and write the book in the way you want it, and then to pursue publication afterwards. That's what I would suggest. But use the place you live in, use the features of the place and what it means to you as a human being as well. Okay, which kind of probably takes us into the next question, which is from Simangele. She says, I'm not sure whether to start with my character or with working out the story. How do you approach the beginning of a book? People are often terrified. They want to start a book. And I have this feeling every time I start a book. What am I going to write about? Who's my protagonist going to be? What crime is there going to be? And I don't think that the one is necessarily divorced from the other. I mean, the notes I've made to Simangele are basically, there is no secret. A crime is a good idea and a character is a good idea. So basically, to start, you need to have some sense of a crime that you'd like to explore and some sense of a character and possibly where that crime is set and where the investigation is set. And then you sit down on your seat for a couple of hours a day and you begin to explore. And that might be through a bit of research or it might be through your own writing. So I'm not sure there's any right place to start a book. For me, I'm thinking of my third Ray Valentine book that I'm working on now. It does become easier if you have a series because you have your protagonist already. So that's one thing you don't have to worry about. I just thought to myself, thank God, I've got Ray Valentine. She's my private investigator. At least I don't have to come up with someone new. But I did need a crime, and it took me a long time to find something that I was interested in exploring. And in order to do that, I kept my eyes on the newspaper. I watched the news, and I saw what kind of I responded to on a gut level, and what crimes I thought would be interesting for me as a person to research on and to investigate. So I think if one's going to write a crime novel, that's really what one needs, a sense of a crime. And of course, some characters just to start off with. I'm not too sure which comes first, the chicken or the egg. I don't think either. Yeah, so, and quite often I find that I'll start a new book and I don't really know where to start. So I set myself little exercises. I will simply write about Muizenberg, this seaside village where I live, or I'll write about the homeless people because I am interested in the homeless and I think I'm going to use them in my book in some way. So, yeah, so not sure whether to start with a character or working out the story. You know, a lot of people do this simultaneously as well. They have a character and they formulate plot at the same time. Story is what's going to happen. Plot is the way, or the steps basically that story is going to unfold through. So some people are very meticulous about writing plot and others allow it more organically. And that's basically what I will do. I've got some idea of how I want to approach everything. And I usually definitely have an idea of an ending for the book, but the rest is quite amorphous. So yeah, what about you, Mish? Can you help Simangele? I mean, I think, you know.
Yeah, I think that it will, you know, I think that the way people start books is sort of the way that they kind of live their lives. So I think it depends on what kind of temperament you have and character you have. And I'm quite a sort of chaotic person. So when I start a book, it's usually just a very chaotic process of being like a whole lot of things will interest me, or it's usually one thing that interests me, and then it won't let go. It just sort of stays with me, and it becomes more and more interesting to me. And I want to, it's like almost a question that I want to answer myself. So, for example, with my first book, the question was, if somebody is falsely accused of something, of a crime, then but it's all rumor and supposition, and there's no real proof. It's just people talking, and this person becomes sort of vilified and becomes kind of judged and hung, drawn, and quartered without there ever being a trial, there ever being an investigation. How does that sort of impact on that person's psychology? You know, how would it feel to be somebody who's accused of something, but you have no way of proving whether or not it ever happened, because the witness was a child? So, so you know, something will happen. Like, and the way it happened was, I heard a man at a bar. I was at a bar, and I heard him talking and saying that, you know, he knew this man, and he was bad mouthing this person, and it was someone I sort of vaguely knew on the outskirts, and they were saying, oh, this person was a pedophile. Just said it without, you know, no proof, no evidence whatsoever, nothing. And I was absolutely horrified by the way this man had just openly just discussed this person with no evidence. I hardly knew the person, but now I've got this image in my head, and it's, you know, it's probably not true. And then the more I dug into that story, the more convinced I became that it actually wasn't true. But now there's doubt. There's doubt about a character. There's doubt about a person. And that sort of haunted me. There was something about that. So often it'll just be an idea that comes into your head, and for some reason it preoccupies you. It might not even be a particularly interesting idea, you know. But I find that that's usually, I'll start off thinking, like, how would that play out? What, you know, what kind of person would this be? And if they were, who would accuse them, and where would they live? And, you know, so it kind of builds like that in quite a chaotic way. And like Joanne, I'm also sort of trying to work out a third book in a series with this sort of same character. And then you find that the weird thing is, then that sort of limits you in a weird sort of way, because on one way you've got this character that you really, that you don't have to invent, but then you also kind of, you now have cut off a whole lot of options, you know. Like when you start a book, you usually you can write anything you like, and then it narrows down. I mean, I've just been reading George Sanders' book, Swim in a Pond, or whatever it is. And he goes through one of Chekhov's short stories called The Cart, and he takes it page by page, and he shows you how story just narrows down. How it starts off with so many possibilities, and then narrows and narrows and narrows and narrows down. And I think that's what happens when you write. You start off with an idea or something, and then you have a character, and then that means you've got that character and you haven't got other characters. So therefore that character sort of sets you on a path that you've got to go along. And so it's just starting, I would say, to Simangele, just start anywhere, start with anything. You might not even use what you write. I think too many people start books thinking they must know what the book's about, but you don't actually have to know. It's something that you find out as you go along.
And in fact, just to add to that, I've never really started with a character or a story. I've always had a setting in mind. The first book I did, I had been to China, and I'd been to the wet markets, and I found that quite fascinating. And all I knew was that I wanted to write a scene in a wet market where snakes are imprisoned and slit for their blood, and dogs are in cages, and For me, it was just so fascinating that I wanted to write a scene. And then the next book was really around xenophobia. That was something that I wanted to explore. But I went down the Orange River, and the Orange River, just to be on the banks of that river, for me was inspirational. I knew that I wanted the end of the book to be set on the Orange River. And then the third book was set in a psychiatric hospital. And that's basically all I knew. I just knew that I wanted to set it in a psychiatric hospital. So yeah, you just have to allow yourself the time to explore and write lots of stuff, some which you'll use and some which you won't. Shall we move on to the next question?
Yes, there's just a little bit of an extension on this question about plotting. You know, I'm great with ideas, and this Kate Thompson Ferreira saying she's great with ideas and places and with a what if scenario, but then she gets stuck at the and then what, you know, and Simangele says that also happens to her. And then Lynn says, I've heard that many writers know the ending and work backwards. So I agree with that. You know, crime is quite tightly plotted, more than most novels or most forms, most genres, but not necessarily, but it should feel like it has a kind of mechanism. And it has, because it's often based around a mystery or an investigation, it does have to have one thing follows another in a quite a logical pattern, but it also has to be surprising. It also has to take, you know, it also has to upend people's expectations. So, and the only way you can do that really is to just write one scene after another. And sometimes, you know, we say that offering screenwriting is just one damn thing after another, and it's true. It's just one scene, and then the next scene, maybe that scene doesn't work. You throw it out, you write another scene, or you just carry on. And somewhere the book weirdly starts to take shape. You might have to throw a whole lot of it in the dustbin, but that's kind of, you know, no writer sits down and starts writing perfect prose off the bat. It's always a process of editing and changing and cutting and fiddling and moving chapters around and cutting out characters and
to add to that, Mish, it's a process of brainstorming. I'm just looking at Kate Thompson saying, I get stuck at the then what. You know, when we are at that point, that is a process of coming up with ideas. You know, whether you use bubbles or make lists or go and chat to a friend and, you know, this is the other thing about writing books. We don't have to do it alone in our little garret anymore. We can discuss things with people that we trust. We can say, you know, this is where my protagonist is. Help me come up with ideas, or what next? What happens next? And often if I write that sentence, what happens next, in a notebook, and I go to sleep and the next morning I just focus on that, my subconscious mind often gives me answers or gives me lists. And from those, I can choose what happens next. So it's a very normal thing that happens to writers. You get to a point where you do feel a bit stuck. But, you know, it's also like turning on a tap. Once you've turned it on, the water keeps on coming. So you just have to go with that metaphor of keeping the taps on, and something will come.
And I think writing through the blocks, you know, learning to sort of live with your bad writing.
Yes.
Accepting that this is bad writing. I know it's bad, but I'm going to carry on anyway. Yeah. And hopefully it will get better, as, you know, I will go back and I'll clean that up and I'll fix it up and I'll write it better, and so on.
Shall we move on to the next question? I'm just aware that we've got kind of more
time issues.
Answer. Yeah. Mara McFadden, would you like to read that one out, Mish?
Okay, Mara asks, I've been reading a lot about the hero's journey recently, and I wondered if it can be applied to crime fiction too. I'd love to hear if either of you used it when plotting your books, or if you can see it in your books after the fact. Okay, so I do use the hero's journey, of course, because we teach the hero's journey at All About Writing, and it's a very big part of our approach to how you set about developing a story. So And I think the hero's journey can apply to any story. It underpins just about any kind of genre and any kind of story that you can write. So, and, you know, like all models, I mean, I don't follow it slavishly, of course, but in a general sort of way, it's always in the back of my mind. And it's kind of always at the side of my desk, kind of, you know, I'll raise questions like, do I have enough of the ordinary world here? Have I established the ordinary world? Is this the ordinary world? Or has this person crossed over into the extraordinary world? Is this the inciting incident or the call to adventure? I will, you know, it's not conscious with everything I do, but it's always sort of slightly in the background. It'll come back, especially if I'm stuck. But I don't obsess about it. And maybe because I know that model very well from screenplays, etc. I'm not always aware that I'm following it, but it is always at my elbow, so to speak. It's a kind of a guide that keeps me on track. And I think it's a really, really valuable kind of blueprint, especially if you feel stuck. What do you, Joanne? Do you use the hero's journey?
Yeah, the hero's journey, to be honest, I don't really know much about the hero's journey. And I was sitting here thinking, I need to do this course with Michéle and Richard and find out more about the hero's journey. So I can't really, I don't feel equipped to comment on that. But I mean, just my instinctive feel is that the hero somehow is the one who is going to restore justice to the world. I mean, does that make sense to you? So you've got to keep that in mind all the time, you know, how to create rounded characters and what the journey is going to be. So let alone the hero, there's the book has got to keep moving, the story has to keep moving, and the protagonist in some way has got to change and develop by the end of the story. So, you know, often people say, yeah, crime fiction, some people dismiss it. I mean, I think very, you know, it doesn't happen much these days, but, you know, there's no character development in crime fiction. And in fact, there is so much tremendous development in crime fiction because people don't want to read about cardboard cutouts. They want to read about real people and the struggles of real people and these real people that are involved in the world of trying to find baddies and put them behind bars or whatever the case is. So for me, character development is very important, that one needs a protagonist, whether it's a policeman or a PI or a forensic scientist that one can really believe in. And I guess that is the hero because, you know, they set the world right by the end of the book. And I think that's why I got into crime fiction in the first place as a young reader, is that I liked this idea that justice could be done. And I did root for a hero, even if they were an anti-hero, just someone who would have the courage to fix things, to do the work of the investigator. Shall we move on? Okay. Lana Cronier asks about villains. With regards to villains, what would you say makes a great villain? Characteristics, traits, and how should the villain be portrayed? Phew, great villains. I love villains. I've always been fascinated by completely over-the-top villains, and I think this was ever since I fell in love with James Bond when I was, 13 years old or whatever. James was so classy and cool and sophisticated and supremely confident. And then he fought against these completely over-the-top villains, and I absolutely loved them. People like Auric Goldfinger, the gold bullion dealer, and Hugo Drax, a tech genius, a little bit like, I suppose, our modern day Elon Musk, and Max Zorin, who dealt with genetics, a psychopath super baby kind of created by, some Nazi experiment. So, and those villains were so bad and so cruel and so, what is the word? They operated in the world over. They had immense power. And I just loved those villains. And truly, I think maybe that's why I like reading crime fiction, is I'm almost more interested in the villains than in the protagonists, because the protagonists, the cops and people, they've got to have a measure of sanity. That said, those protagonists also are just flawed human beings, and the best cops, the best protagonists are usually those people who we can relate to as well, because we all have issues around depression or drinking a little bit too much, or, you know, not getting to work on time, or being so drunk we can't even get to work. I mean, those are the cops that we, and I'm just saying cops as a general feeling, the cops and people who go and explore the crimes that we relate to and that we root for. But I think one needs strong protagonists, because, you know, that's really what interests us, or me. I've got to speak from my personal point of view, that the strong, ugly, awful protagonist who's done terrible things, wanting to blow up the world or kill people or hold young girls in a cellar for 10 years, abuse little boys, whatever the crime is. I want him to get his comeuppance in the world, and I actually want him to be dreadful. I'm looking at a couple of other evil protagonists I've got here. Professor Moriarty. I mean, most of you would know Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes has this lifetime quest to uncover Moriarty, and Moriarty he's an absolute criminal mastermind. So he keeps Sherlock Holmes on his toes. You know, we also like villains who are intelligent, who are a match for our protagonists. So bear that in mind. Hannibal Lecter, for example, who liked eating people. I mean, you all remember him, and his and Clarice was a Clarice starring who interviewed him when he was in prison, found out the kind of things that he was doing. But most of these protagonists also have a certain charm to them and a certain fascination. And I think that is also what makes a good sorry, I said protagonist. Most of these villains have got a charm to them and a sort of seduction. And we're drawn in by these villains because of this. So for me, it's important to have strong villains. Yeah, another one, the Joker. You know, the Joker with his twisted sense of humor that makes him such a powerful villain. And he's consumed with his obsession by Batman. And I think it's also that partnership, that Batman and Joker partnership, that makes that crime story so strong. And then we get back to Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty and Clarice and Hannibal Lecter and a lot of the greats in crime fiction, that there's the symbiosis between them. There's a connection between them. And the great crime writers manage to create the sense of the fact that the villain and the protagonist almost need each other, that they're well matched. So yeah, what makes a great villain? Evil, frightening, authentic, dangerous, but also seen to have his human side, simply so that the reader can sometimes relate to him as well. Otherwise we'd throw the book across the room. And very bad people often have good sides to them. You know, the pedophile might be a really good father to his own children. Someone who robs a bank and kills the teller might do it simply because they are starving, and that might lead to a crime spree, of course. But I think it does help if there's a side to a villain that captures the sympathy, in a sense, of the reader. Yeah, we're heading on to 5-2. Would you like to add to that, Michéle? But yeah, you can have a lot of fun with your villains. I write from the villain's point of view. Now, I don't know what that says about me, that I think I was a villain at some stage in a previous life, because I love to get into the villain's head. You know, I love to be in that position of, I'm now going to do something terrible, murder someone, or yeah, just do something really awful, which can be quite scary, but it's also part of crime writing.
Yeah, I think with regards to how would you make a great villain? I think also if you use, you know, we all have like these horrible parts of ourselves that we don't really like, or we hide away from people. Sort of murderous impulses, people that we really hate or we don't like, or we feel resentment towards, or actually, you know, envy, jealousy. I mean, I think you have to draw on all the sort of most negative aspects of your own character and actually just allow that. That's the fun thing about writing baddies, is you can't, all the horrible things that you have locked up inside you, all the nasty little demons and witches, can find some sort of fulfillment. They can come out and they can play, and you can make them bigger and badder than they would ever normally be, maybe, because we just repress our murderous instincts. And I think the reason people read crime and are so interested in crime is because of the baddies, more than anything else, because it's kind of, okay, if I just let my freak flag fly here and just kind of did, you know, just had no inhibitions, how would I behave? You know, what would I do? And that's one of the fun things I think about writing villains. And of course, villains come in all shapes and sizes. I mean, I think we're seeing the rise of the narcissistic villain now, because obviously we've had people like Trump and so on, and Jacob Zuma. So we've got these people who are charming, or seem to be, or wealthy, or they're TV hosts, or whatever they are, but they're actually total criminals, absolutely amoral people who would go to any lengths to win. And yeah, I mean, villains are fun. Villains are big fun. And I think we all, writers all love writing villains, and just let yourself go mad. I mean, Joanne loves a very grand guignol type of villain. I know in her books, I remember her villains very well, because they are very, 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 very immediately like, this is really a villain. But you can get also very quiet villains. You know, you can get someone like Tom Ripley, the Ripley books, and he's just a everyday sociopath, you know, narcissistic sociopath. But you wouldn't notice him because he's busy planting his dahlias in the garden, and you wouldn't look at him twice. So yeah, I would say.
And
anything.
I butt in at this point. I got some fantastic advice at some stage to this effect, that if your novel is flagging, whatever it is, whether it's a crime novel or a love story or whatever, if there does seem to be a problem and you can't put your finger on it, the solution is frequently to strengthen your antagonist. Not to worry so much about your protagonist, the good guy, the good girl, but to worry more about strengthening your antagonist. Because you then give your protagonist a worthy adversary. You make them step up to the plate. You give them a challenge that they have to exceed themselves at meeting. Right. Anyway, there have been some more questions raised in the chat box, but we have run out of time, I'm afraid. One of them that I thought really worth exploring, and maybe we will have to schedule another webinar on the subject, was Emily's, who said, do we have any thoughts about sci-fi crime set in the future? And I have thoughts about that, which we don't have time to explore. What we do have time to explore now is to tell you about the workshop that Joanne and Michéle are running on the 25th on crime writing, where they will explore an aspect of writing crime. They will set the participants an assignment, and they will give instant feedback to them, all on Zoom. It's a regular monthly Saturday workshop that we hold on a variety of genres. Saturday, the 25th of September, is assigned to crime. Do sign up as soon as possible if you're interested, because we have to restrict the numbers of participants to make sure that everyone has a chance to get that feedback. If you're unavailable on the 25th, you don't despair, because we make the workshop available virtually with a recording of Michéle and Joanne's remarks, and they will give full feedback to whatever assignments you produce. One final remark, Mish did say that we run a course on the hero's journey. In fact, the next hero's journey is available towards the end of October. We will give you details about that in the note that we will send all participants next week, tomorrow. And that brings us to the end. So Joanne and Mish, thank you very much indeed. I found it fascinating. I want to write crime now, or at least commit a crime if I can't bring myself to write it. And it's been fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And thanks everybody for tuning in. It was really good. And thanks, Joanne. It was great chatting to a fellow crime writer.
But unfortunately, time always does run out on us.
Yes,
but
it was really great chatting to you.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone for sending in your questions. Happy crime writing.